He assumed she was just another gold digger in first class, until he found out the truth. The first-class cabin carried the distinct scent of leather and wealth, a quiet hum of conversation filling the air alongside the occasional clink of a champagne glass. Overhead bins snapped shut as passengers settled in, adjusting their designer bags and glancing at their watches. Nathan Kessler barely looked up from his phone as he dropped into seat 3A, his preferred window seat. He radiated the kind of confidence that came from years of closing high-stakes deals and sitting in boardrooms where people laughed at his jokes, even when they weren't funny. Before takeoff, he ordered a scotch, loosening his tie just enough to send a silent message: he belonged here. The flight from Dallas to Tampa was under 3 hours, not long, but enough time to enjoy the perks of first-class travel. He had no plans to work, not when he could sip premium drinks and scan the cabin. That's when he noticed her. A blonde woman a few rows ahead, scrolling through her iPad, her profile just visible. Something about her felt oddly familiar, though he couldn't quite place it. Maybe a local news anchor? A C-list actress? Someone who had burned through her 15 minutes of fame and was clinging to the last few seconds. He smirked, nudging the man beside him, a quiet traveler who had the misfortune of sitting next to someone who loved the sound of his own voice. Ever notice how some people think money can buy class? Nathan mused, just loud enough for nearby passengers to catch. His seatmate offered a polite chuckle, eyes glued to the in-flight magazine, clearly uninterested. But Nathan didn't need encouragement to keep talking. She looks familiar, he added, tilting his head. Probably some reality TV reject. You know the type: big hair, expensive handbag, and no idea how to blend in. His words floated through the cabin, landing in the ears of those around him. A few passengers glanced his way, but the woman remained fixed on her iPad, either unaware or uninterested in his commentary. That didn't sit well with him. People like her were supposed to care what men like him thought. As the plane taxied down the runway, the flight attendant moved through the aisle, checking seatbelts and collecting empty glasses, unaware that this flight was about to take an unexpected turn. Nathan leaned back, stretching slightly, already bored before the flight had even begun. He watched as the blonde woman gracefully handed off her drink, offering the flight attendant a polite smile. Her posture was composed, her demeanor effortless. It irritated him. There was a quiet confidence about her, an ease that suggested she wasn't the type to be rattled by side comments or sideways glances. And that only made Nathan double down. Shifting in his seat, he made sure his voice carried just enough. She must have married well, he mused, shaking his head as if the thought amused him. That's usually how these stories go: with third husband, maybe fourth. Plastic surgeon on speed dial. It's always the same. This time, the shift in the air was undeniable. The businessman across the aisle shot him a brief but pointed glance. The flight attendant hesitated ever so slightly as she passed by. Even the man sitting next to him exhaled, quiet but telling, as if he wished he could be anywhere else. Nathan, of course, either didn't notice or simply didn't care. He reached for his scotch as the plane lifted off, tapping his fingers against the glass. 3 hours, plenty of time to entertain himself. But what he didn't realize was that his entertainment was about to come at his own expense. The plane had barely reached cruising altitude when Nathan picked up where he left off. He wasn't the kind of man to let things go, especially not when he felt ignored. The woman, whoever she was, had barely acknowledged him, hadn't reacted, hadn't even spared him a glance. That didn't sit right with him. The moment the seatbelt sign flicked off, he flagged down the flight attendant with an exaggerated wave, as if he were calling for another round at a bar instead of sitting in first class. Another scotch, he said, handing over his empty glass. Then, with a smirk, he nodded toward the blonde woman. And whatever she's having too, on me. It was a test, a way to get a reaction. Maybe she'd laugh, shake her head, indulge in a bit of harmless banter. Women like her loved attention, or at least, that's what he assumed. But the flight attendant didn't so much as blink. "She's fine, sir," she replied smoothly, taking his glass and moving on before he could push further. Nathan chuckled to himself, shaking his head. So, she was one of those, the kind of woman who carried herself like she was better than everyone else, who acted as if she was above small talk. He turned to his reluctant seatmate, who had just opened a book, an obvious attempt to avoid conversation. "You ever notice that?" Nathan asked, tapping the armrest between them. "How some people walk around like they're the main character in life. Like the rest of us are just extras in a little movie?" The man glanced up briefly, then returned to his book. "Haven't really thought about it." Nathan grinned, undeterred. "I'll tell you exactly who she is," he continued, keeping his voice at that perfect volume, not loud enough to be outright rude, but just enough for those nearby to hear. "She's the kind of woman who gets by on her last name, on favors. Some senator's ex-wife, maybe. Or one of those lawyers who loves the camera but couldn't win a case to save her life." He let the words linger, waiting for something, a shift, a reaction, any sign that he was getting under her skin. But there was nothing. The blonde woman remained completely unbothered, scrolling through her tablet as if he didn't exist. Like he wasn't even worth acknowledging. And for the first time, Nathan felt something unexpected creeping in, the unsettling realization that, perhaps, he was the only one playing this game. Nathan exhaled sharply, adjusting his watch in irritation. This wasn't fun anymore. "Not even a glance," he muttered. "Guess she's too important for the rest of us." A few rows back, a woman in a navy pantsuit exchanged a knowing look with her seatmate, an older gentleman briefly raising a brow over his newspaper. People were noticing him now, but in his arrogance, Nathan assumed they were on his side, sharing his disdain for the blonde woman. That emboldened him. Leaning forward, he rested an elbow on the armrest, lowering his voice just enough to sound conspiratorial. "Mark my words," he smirked. "She's going to post something later about how exhausting travel is. Probably complain about manspreading or some nonsense. Women like her love playing the victim." But before he could continue, a calm, firm voice cut through his self-satisfaction. "Excuse me, sir." Expecting the flight attendant, Nathan turned, only to meet the blonde woman's gaze for the first time. She faced him fully, her expression unreadable, neither angry nor irritated. Just watching. And in that quiet, measured look, something stirred in Nathan, something uncomfortable, something foreign. For the first time, he felt aware of how his voice had carried. But he shook it off, waiting for her to argue, to scold him, to give him something to justify his behavior. Instead, she studied him for a beat, then offered the faintest, most unreadable smile before turning back to her tablet. Like he wasn't worth her time. And that, more than anything, unnerved him. Nathan adjusted his cufflink as if that could smooth over the discomfort creeping into his chest. That look, it wasn't dismissive, nor annoyed. It was worse. It was knowing. Like she had seen 100 men like him before and had already decided he wasn't worth the effort. He should have rolled his eyes and gone back to his scotch. But instead, it gnawed at him. The flight attendant set his drink down with a polite nod, nothing more, and Nathan noticed it, no warmth, no small talk. Had she heard him, too? He took a slow sip, glancing at the woman again. Pam. That was her name. It tickled something in his memory, though he couldn't quite place it. She remained engrossed in her tablet, but now, with that one acknowledgement between them, an invisible line had been drawn, a silent dare. And Nathan didn't do well with dares. "Pam, is it?" he said casually, low enough to feign indifference, but just loud enough to be overheard. "You don't look like a Pam." Nothing. A flicker of something twisted in his stomach, but he pressed on. "I mean, no offense," he added. "You just seem more like a Kelly or a Lauren." He chuckled, shaking his head. "Pam sounds like someone's mom." Still nothing. The silence had shifted. Now, it wasn't just her ignoring him. It was her letting him embarrass himself. Across the aisle, the older gentleman had gone back to his paper, but Nathan had seen the brief, assessing glance. 2 rows up, a young businessman pretended to type on his laptop, but Nathan knew the game. He was listening. Even the flight attendant, passing with a tray, kept him in her peripheral vision. The realization settled in his stomach like a lead weight. They weren't laughing with him. He exhaled sharply, leaning back. Fine. Let them judge. People were so uptight these days, acting like a little light-hearted teasing was some kind of personal attack. He hadn't said anything that bad. He drained his scotch, setting the glass down harder than necessary, and at that exact moment, the universe decided to deliver the final blow. "Miss Bondi, would you like another beverage?" The words barely registered. But then the blonde woman, Pam, looked up and politely declined. And Nathan's brain caught up. Bondi. Pam Bondi. His entire body tensed. His fingers curled slightly on the armrest. Oh, God. It all clicked. Former Attorney General of Florida. Nationally known. Politically connected. A legal bulldog who had taken on some of the most powerful people in the country. She wasn't just familiar because she had been on television. She had been on television because she was the kind of woman who could ruin a man's life with a single phone call. Nathan's throat went dry. He stole another glance at her, but she still wasn't looking at him. She didn't need to. She already knew. And now, so did he. For the first time all flight, Nathan had nothing to say. His mind raced, scrambling for an escape. Pam Bondi. The name echoed in his head, unraveling his confidence thread by thread. His fingers tightened around the armrest. How had he not recognized her sooner? Of course he had seen her before, on news broadcasts, at press conferences, and courtroom footage aired on every major network. She had gone toe-to-toe with corporations, tangled with politicians, and won. And now? Now he was sitting just a few feet away, realizing that all his smug, half-whispered remarks had landed in the worst possible place. The blood drained from his face. He glanced around the cabin, suddenly hyper-aware of how many people had been within earshot. The older gentleman. The businessman pretending to type. The flight attendant. All of them had heard. Had he just mocked a former attorney general in front of an entire first-class cabin? Nathan swallowed hard, shifting uncomfortably in his seat. He had to fix this. Nathan turned slightly toward her, forcing a smile that felt stiff at the edges. I thought you looked familiar, he chuckled, feigning lightness. Didn't realize I was in the presence of Florida royalty. But Pam didn't react, she didn't turn, didn't speak, just kept reading as if he were nothing more than background noise. Nathan's stomach twisted. She had heard every word, registered every comment, and decided he wasn't worth the effort. That was worse than if she had called him out, much worse. If she had fired back, at least he could have argued, deflected, turned it into a joke. But this was deliberate. She was letting him drown in his own embarrassment. Nathan shifted, pretending to adjust his seatbelt, scrambling for something to smooth things over. I actually followed some of your cases back in the day, he tried, keeping his tone light. You've had quite the career. Nothing. No glance, no acknowledgement. His skin prickled. He exhaled, rubbing his jaw, suddenly aware of just how long this flight still had to go. It was one thing to be embarrassed for a moment, it was another to be trapped at 35,000 feet with no escape, sitting in the tension he had created. And just when he thought it couldn't get worse, the flight attendant returned. Another drink, sir? Nathan opened his mouth, then hesitated. For some reason, another scotch didn't sit right. Just water, he muttered. The flight attendant nodded, taking his empty glass. That's when he noticed it, a flicker of amusement in Pam's eyes. She hadn't turned, hadn't spoken, but in that instant, he knew she had been watching, waiting, and now she was enjoying every second of his discomfort. For the first time in a long time, Nathan Kessler knew exactly how it felt to be small. He sat rigid, the weight of his own words pressing down on him like an anvil. How had he let this happen? He was usually good at reading people, controlling conversations, making sure he never looked like the fool. But here he was, dismantled by a woman who hadn't said a single word to him. His mind scrambled for an exit strategy. Should he apologize? Make a joke? Pretend none of it happened? He glanced at the other passengers, gauging the damage. The businessman across the aisle wasn't looking at him anymore, but the smirk on his lips told Nathan he had been watching. The flight attendant remained professional, offering only a neutral glance as she set down his water. "Thanks," Nathan muttered. She nodded and moved on, and somehow, that was worse, she didn't pity him, didn't care. He wasn't important enough to care about. He looked back at Pam. Still reading, still unfazed, still carrying herself like someone who had already moved on. And maybe that's what hurt the most. She wasn't angry, wasn't waiting for an apology. She had simply decided he wasn't worth a second thought. Nathan hated that feeling, and it was his own fault. His fingers tapped restlessly against the tray table. He thought about the stories he had read about her, the legal battles, the high-profile cases, the people who had tried to intimidate her and failed. And he, like an idiot, had assumed she would care about his opinion. He exhaled slowly. Maybe it was the altitude, or maybe it was the fact that he had nowhere to go, but for the first time in a long time, he started thinking about the kind of person he had become. He had spent years walking into rooms like he owned them, speaking as if his words carried more weight than anyone else's, assuming his version of reality was the only one that mattered. But here, in this moment, he wasn't the powerful one. He wasn't the one in control. And he didn't like how that felt. The plane hummed softly around him, the cabin settling into quiet conversation and the occasional clink of glasses. Nathan picked up his water, taking a sip as he stared blankly at the seat in front of him. Maybe this was a lesson people like him didn't learn until they had no choice. Maybe this was exactly what he deserved. He turned toward the window, watching the sky stretch endlessly beyond the wing, and for the first time, he felt something foreign, smallness. Insignificance. For years, he had been the center of his own universe, the man people laughed with even when his jokes weren't funny, the voice they nodded along with even when he had nothing of value to say. He was used to commanding attention. But today, he had been reminded of something he had long forgotten. Respect wasn't about money, power, or being the loudest in the room. It was about character. Pam Bondi had done nothing to put him in his place, because she didn't have to. His own arrogance had done the job for her. Nathan took another sip of water, feeling the coolness settle in his throat. It wasn't scotch, but maybe that was for the best. For once, he needed to sit with his thoughts without drowning them in alcohol. He glanced at her again, half expecting her to finally turn, to throw him a look of satisfaction. But she didn't. She was done with him. She had been done with him the moment she realized what kind of man he was. That realization twisted in his chest. It wasn't often that someone like him had to face himself, to sit in the discomfort of knowing he had been the fool in the room. Nathan sighed, rubbing his temple. Maybe it was time he started listening more and talking less. Maybe it was time he started thinking before assuming he knew everything. The flight attendant passed by again, but for the first time, he didn't wave her down for another drink. Instead, he sat quietly, watching the sky as the plane began its descent into Tampa. And in that moment, he realized this wasn't about Pam Bondi. This was about the kind of man he wanted to be from here on out. How often do we judge people before we even know who they are? How many times do we let arrogance blind us to the truth? Maybe the real lesson isn't about power or status. Maybe it's about learning to treat people with respect before we regret it. If this story made you think, hit that subscribe button. Who knows? Maybe next time, you'll catch yourself before making the same mistake.